Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a second. We're just going to let everybody trickle in here. Thank you so much for coming. For those just joining, we'll start in just a second. We're just allowing everyone to get in here. Thank you. Okay, hi. Welcome to the final Balancing Work and Cancer webinar of 2023. My name is Scott Sinclair. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Now, Cancer and Careers is a national nonprofit, and we are the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. We do so via comprehensive website, free publications in English and Spanish, and career coaching. Additionally, we offer educational seminars targeted at employees with cancer and their colleagues and healthcare providers. And certainly employers and caregivers can benefit from the information as well, especially today. To stay informed about the programs as they're rolled out, please sign up for our newsletter if you're not already, and by visiting our website, cancerandcareers.org, where you'll find access to all of our publications free of charge. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. And for those of you who don't require this information, please bear with me. I promise to make this as quick as possible. Today's webinar is accredited by ANCC, ASWB, the New York State Education Department State Board for Social Work, and the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society for Human Resource Management. If you plan on requesting educational credits for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must log in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and the post-test, as well as receive a passing grade of 80% or higher on the post-test that we will send out. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information. The follow-up email will be sent no later than 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow on Thursday, December 8th, and certificates will be emailed within 4 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters of this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and no commercial support was provided for this program. Now, thanks in part to our direct support from Genentech, HSN, and QVC, Cancer and Careers is able to offer this 8th year of the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series. This program was created to provide patients and survivors, as well as their care teams and employers, with concise, targeted information about the work-related issues that arise after a diagnosis. Additionally, we'd like to thank our year-long sponsors who support all of our core programs and allow us to continue providing all resources and services free of charge. Now, as many of you know, cancer often impacts more than just the person with the diagnosis. And for those in a caregiving role, there's often new emotional and practical responsibilities taken on. Caring for a loved one includes many components. It can often feel as if those who are caregiving are working 2 full-time jobs, which can lead to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. The challenge is to meet these many responsibilities while also preserving energy for yourself, your family, and your job. Today, we're going to talk about the many considerations while navigating caretaking responsibilities and employment. We'll discuss the importance of gathering information and getting yourself organized so you're in one place to make important decisions. This includes understanding workplace policies, decisions about disclosure, how to effectively communicate at work to protect yourself, your job, and to make space for caregiving in your life. Leading today's webinar is Cancer and Careers Assistant Director of Programs, Nicole Jarvis. Nicole is a licensed social worker who has been with CAC for 7 years. Prior to joining CAC, she spent 4 years at Memorial Sloan Kettering, as well as a practicing social worker in the area of child welfare. It's my pleasure to welcome Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Hello, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I know evening webinars can be a little tough, so we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight. So as we get started, I just want to start really by talking about something that many of you as caregivers can likely relate to. We know that caregivers of people diagnosed with a serious or chronic medical condition often find themselves confronting some common misconceptions related to work that can be relatively difficult for them. Some of these misconceptions can include they don't want to work or won't be as productive because of their caregiving responsibilities. Or perhaps that because they themselves are quote unquote fine, they don't need any special consideration, or that they can easily compartmentalize or separate their jobs from their caregiving experience. Again, all these listed here are generally misconceptions, which means that they're largely faulty ideas and notions, and they also serve as barriers to really understanding the full picture of an individual's experience. So really one of the goals for this evening is to illustrate that there's so much more nuance involved with caregiving in the workplace, and a lot more than these misconceptions really allow for. So really quickly, we just want to launch a poll just to kind of get a temperature check on who's joining us this evening. It should be popping up in just a minute. So if you wouldn't mind just letting us know what brought you here tonight, how you identify as a caregiver, and we'll share the results and kind of just have a sense of really who's on the call tonight. And of course, for those of you who this question might not apply to, or those of you that are checking off other, which I see a couple of those coming in, if you would feel comfortable, please go ahead and share in the chat what that other might constitute as. All right, we'll just give you guys just another second or two to respond. All right. So it does look like we have a mix of people tonight. The majority of you don't personally identify as a caregiver, so some of you may be joining us as perhaps people who are supporting caregivers, or healthcare providers who might be speaking with and supporting caregivers as well. We have oncology social workers. We have lots of social workers, nurse navigators. So of course, this information is really applicable to a lot of people, and it's really helpful to be able to kind of share some of these resources and some of this information with those who might benefit from it. So thank you all for sharing with us tonight. And again, thanks for coming tonight. So, it's really important to recognize the shared experience of caregivers. The AARP Public Policy Institute released a report on caregiving in 2020, and there were a lot of really important insights included. As you can see here, the majority of caregivers were managing work either part or full-time while caregiving. And of those, many experienced an impact to their employment situation as a result of their caregiving responsibilities. These included days off, cutting back work hours, and even leaves of absence were all cited as ways that they changed their approach to work while they were caregiving. Now, this, of course, is not everyone, and this was not a cancer-specific study, but it can be really validating to recognize that these are some of the ways that caregivers were balancing their work and caregiving responsibilities, and could maybe just spark some ideas for those who may be struggling with figuring out how to make that balance. If you're interested in looking at the full study, it's very interesting. The link to that is at the bottom, and this is from the slides that were shared via email before this session. And if you don't have access to that, Scott can go ahead and share that in the chat box. So we can't really discuss the experience of caregiving without digging into some of the challenges that are associated. So from that same study, there were 3 primary struggles that were cited. So first, there was the mental strain. There are feelings of stress, guilt, anger, anxiety, and really so much more that were really prevalent among caregivers. Nearly 40% saying that it was an emotionally stressful experience for them. Then there's also the physical strain. So experiencing their own health challenges as a result of this new amount of emotional stress, but also some of the physical aspects, such as less time in the day to address self-care, maybe less sleep, more household responsibilities and tasks. Maybe you were someone who really enjoyed exercise and that was a big part of your life, but unfortunately you just don't have the time for that anymore. So, here you see that 23% of caregivers were saying that their health was worsened as a result of caregiving. So it's understandable how these things happen when you do tend to lose some of that me time. And then finally, there was the financial strain. So this can be a challenging time to really plan for since there's no set timeline. You don't know the future. As you can see here, the average commitment was 4.5 years, which can certainly contribute to a financial burden if you have to be taking on additional debt like medical debt or a loss in income from your partner or a loss in income if you had to cut back on your work hours. So there's definitely a lot of challenges that are associated with caregiving. So it's really important to recognize what those challenges are for you and then think of solutions that can help you in those instances. So you'll notice that a theme today is that it's really around thinking through your circumstance and how to best approach making really important decisions around best plans of action. So, it's important to remember not to feel obligated to make decisions right away or all at once. Of course, we don't have control over everything, but where you can pace out some of these decisions in order to make the most informed decisions can really work out for the best. It's possible that you're yourself experiencing really strong emotions as related to processing this new diagnosis. The news can bring about a range of feelings: shock, stress, anxiety, depression, numbness, feelings of urgency to really get things moving, and so many more. So regardless of what's going on with you emotionally, it's important for you to know that your feelings are valid and there's no right reaction. Allowing yourself to feel these emotions can be an actually really important part of preparing to make these future decisions. So first things first, taking a beat can be helpful to get yourself centered and focused. Look at what you need to do next and give yourself that space to really breathe and process. This can really help to make those next steps just feel a little bit more manageable. Now, over the next few slides, we're going to really discuss what it looks like to identify and ask yourself key questions that you need to answer. Also, how to properly gather information, and then really get organized in order to better understand what your options are and to make those informed decisions. And then finally, how to make an action plan for moving forward that works around your loved one's treatments, surgeries, medical interventions, and also how, of course, your work might fit into all of these factors. So now that you've taken that deep breath and worked to center yourself so that you're able to focus a little bit better, it's time to figure out what questions to consider asking yourself in order to make those best decisions about balancing work and cancer when also acting as a caregiver. A good place to start is by spending some time considering what your wants are versus only your needs. They tend to vary from person to person, and when people start to list out their wants and needs, they do sometimes find that they aren't in alignment with one another, and that's okay. The idea here is to take a step back and start evaluating the individual parts within the bigger picture to really figure out what's going to be true for you. So for example, what are your financial and your insurance needs? While it's not guaranteed, as we did see from that study, it's likely that your finances will be impacted in some way by your added caregiving responsibilities. So try to think through what those changes will mean for you and your family's ability to stay afloat during this time. Additionally, your loved one may be covered under your insurance. So how do you make sure that that coverage remains uninterrupted as you are trying to navigate how to maintain your employment during this time? Next, how is your identity connected to your job? It may be that you're not able to meet the exact same marks as you were before, since you need to really allocate energy and time elsewhere. So figure out how you might cope with setting the bar perhaps just a little bit lower in order to balance all of your responsibilities. Again, this may not be the case for everybody, but the point is to just really have a sense of how it might come into play for you. And of course, it's important, what might you want to consider in terms of your personal life? Do you have additional obligations to family or other loved ones that might need to be prioritized? What do you think you might need in terms of self-care? You might also find that once you start asking yourself these questions, more questions start to crop up that you don't necessarily know how to answer on your own, and that's okay. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit more shortly. It's also completely understandable if this part of the process starts to feel really overwhelming because it is a lot to take on. So as you really start to think through the answers to many of the questions that you're asking yourself and maybe realizing you don't have the answers to them, you're going to need to begin to gather a decent amount of information. So we tend to separate these into buckets so that they're just a little easier to organize and a little less overwhelming and just a little bit more manageable in the moment. So as you can see here, you're going to be looking for information on your loved one's medical and practical information. So this would include appointments, treatments, surgeries, timelines, anticipated needs and side effects, and so on. But you'll also want to consider and look at your own medical and practical information, which can be your own medical appointments, since your needs and health are not completely on hold at this time. Also looking into additional support and resources, as well as considering what other personal obligations you might have. And then next is work information. So looking into policies, thinking about the culture of your workplace, the job demands, what you know about PTO and leave banks. These can all help to inform some of those decisions in the workplace. And finally, legal information is always worth looking into and understanding, like federal, state, and local laws that may be applicable to a caregiver situation in these circumstances. Now, the place to start when it comes to gathering medical and treatment information is your loved one's medical team and the healthcare providers. So you want to ask about the timeline for surgery and any other treatment protocols like chemo or radiation and what potential side effects might be associated with those. Understanding this information can help you start to figure out whether or not it will be possible for you to work during all or part of your loved one's treatment and how much time you may need to take off from work. Understanding these anticipated side effects will also help you to understand the extent to which you'll be physically needed as a caregiver. So if their side effects leave them totally incapacitated for a certain extent of time, this will be something to take into consideration as you figure out what a realistic plan will look like. Of course, it depends on the needs of your loved ones and your flexibilities at work. It's always a good idea to become aware of whatever supportive services that can be taken advantage of should that need arise. So this can come in the form of transportation, financial assistance opportunities, specific guidance on how to best play the caregiver role, and so much more. So speaking with a hospital social worker or patient advocate can help inform you on the availabilities. Sometimes different organizations offer different supportive services. I know that for some time, Lyft and Uber were offering free rides to treatment and things like that. So it's always worth just checking in to see if there have been any updates or if maybe funds have been re-put into certain programs that are available now. So now we move into gathering information regarding work itself. So this part of the process can really help you start to think about how you can manage your caregiving responsibilities with the way that your company works and also the duties of your job. So for instance, researching your workplace's existing policies and flexibilities can lend insight into how to devise a plan for working full-time and taking care of your loved one. Also, learning about your company's leave policies can also help determine your ability to take time off either in larger or smaller chunks of time. Should those needs change with treatment protocols or responses to treatments? Because as we discussed, anticipated side effects, you never know, everybody responds differently. So you do have to take into account that some of these things might need to change. Much of the information that you're going to be looking for in terms of work information is likely accessible through an online employee portal or in the employee handbook that you can locate and just kind of look through on your own without necessarily having to speak with anybody. That said, you may also prefer to speak with someone or have a conversation with them. So you might find that you need to potentially reach out in order to get a copy of that employee handbook or have some of those questions answered. Just keep in mind that you don't need to explain the reasoning for wanting that information. You can be vague and just say that you're interested in learning more about what the company policies are or to stay updated. Also, if you've been at the company for a while and have seen coworkers maybe taking on the caregiving role, think back to how those conversations were handled in those situations, both the good and the bad aspects, and consider how that might color your situation and experience. And if you have a close enough relationship with the person who did have to take those caregiving responsibilities on, perhaps consider talking to them about how the company responded to them. What approaches did they take? What worked well? What didn't work well? And some of the challenges that they faced, because that can really inform your approach when you are figuring out your ultimate action plan. Now, as we discuss the process of gathering legal information, I'm just going to remind you all that I am a social worker, so the law is not my area of training or licensure. So if you do have specific questions about your situation, I definitely encourage you to reach out to an attorney or a legal organization. But the law does play a very important role in thinking about and talking about work and cancer, which is why we include it. Understandably, it can be scary to start thinking about the law and our jobs. So I just want to stress that, it's not likely that an employment situation will become litigious, but rather legal and practical issues don't exist in separate vacuums. So often where there is a practical concern, there's a practical piece to it as well, or a legal piece to it as well, excuse me. And for many people, the law can become a key tool for helping them pull together a plan for working while balancing additional responsibilities such as caregiving. So again, if you're interested in learning more about which federal or state workplace laws and protections may or may not be available to you as a caregiver, I do encourage you to reach out to a legal expert. You can also find more broad, reliable information about laws on various government websites, educational blogs, and resources. If you're interested in those, you can send us an email and we can share some of those with you. We also have a lot of them listed on our website. Now, one of the relevant federal laws is the Family and Medical Leave Act, so often referred to as the FMLA. So the FMLA can provide eligible caregivers health insurance protected leave, and it allows them to take time off to care for a spouse, parent, or child with a serious medical condition. Now, like all laws, it does have certain limitations and certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So it's worth looking into those. But if you do qualify, you can use this leave in either small or large increments of time. Sometimes the smaller increments can be enough to help a caregiver balance work and the time off that they need for caregiving. So those small increments can be as small as an hour or a day or a week. It's up to 12 weeks of leave. So how you choose to use that is up to you and whatever works best for you. You can find more information on the FMLA section of the U.S. Department's labor website. But again, you also should look into whether there are additional state or local laws that might provide you additional protection. Now, another federal law that is relevant is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it does apply in all 50 states. And like all laws, it does have certain requirements that must be met to use it. What's important for you to know is that eligible caregivers may be protected from discrimination under the ADA, but they are not entitled to reasonable accommodations, which is an additional benefit that's given specifically to individuals with a disability. However, caregiving employees can sometimes collaborate with their employer just to find some smaller modifications that might allow them to stay on the job, and which can have similar benefits for the employer that providing reasonable accommodations do. So some examples of potential modifications might be working a full-time but flexible schedule. So really meaning that you're working the same number of hours, they just might be distributed differently. So perhaps your loved one has late afternoon appointments. So maybe your 9 to 5 day could become a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day. Or if you do have to take time out of your work day to go to an appointment with your loved one, you can make the time up by working later that day or later in the week. Another option might be working from home, part-time or full-time. These days, that might already be how you're working. This obviously can't work for everyone, especially client and customer facing roles, but it is becoming more and more commonplace for a lot of positions that hadn't originally been remote, so it's worth exploring. And again, this is really another opportunity to practice some good communication with your employer and develop a strategy for approaching them to discuss how these modifications would really help you meet the needs of the job while still managing caregiving. It's also important to remember that replacing a valuable employee is time consuming and costly. So a lot of employers are going to want to do everything possible in order to make sure that you can keep your job. And so ultimately, it's important to remember that the only definite no is the question not asked. The worst thing that you can get is a no, that's not going to work. And then you just go back to the drawing board, but it's always worth asking these questions. Excuse me. So now that you have all this information, though necessary and helpful, it can also be a time when things are feeling really overwhelming because you're not only participating in the coordination of care for your loved one, but also addressing what needs to be done for your own circumstances as well. Your life is not put on hold just to caregive. So getting organized and focusing on the individual tasks at hand can be really helpful. Once you've gathered the necessary information regarding work, you can really sit down and assess your options when it comes to what your work and schedule will look like. So based on those company policies, conversations at work, etc. You'll also want to look at your options when it comes to who and what to tell about your situation. Will you prefer to keep this between you and your supervisor? Is it helpful to inform your coworkers so that they're aware? These are all decisions to make based on what you learned or came across in your information gathering phase. Now, getting and staying organized can really help remove some of the strain and stress from work. Being organized can also help you to better be prepared for having a plan A, B, or C, as it's possible and likely that your plan may not work out exactly as you anticipated. So having information on hand to be able to really pivot when necessary can really reduce that stress and help you to plan ahead a little bit better. So some best practices for getting organized. Keeping all of your paperwork and documents in one place may seem like a really simple thing, but it can make a huge difference. Whether you're a fan of curating digital files or prefer to print out hard copies that you can actually touch and highlight, just having a centralized spot can reduce the headache of constantly searching for important details necessary to make appointments, communicate with the insurance company, and so on. You're going to be taking on a lot of those responsibilities as you are caregiving because your loved one just may not feel up to it, may not have the cognitive functioning at that time to do it. So helping you stay organized means that you're going to be on top of things that might not ordinarily be your responsibility. It's also the case that during your initial information gathering, you may come across pieces of information that aren't totally relevant to you at that time, but could be useful down the line. So having all of your information stored in the same place will also mean that you'll know where to look for it when the time comes if it's necessary. Also, writing down questions or concerns or thoughts of who you're caring for can be really helpful as they may be dealing, as I mentioned, with memory and cognitive challenges from treatment or even just the stress of having this experience and their diagnosis. So having a list of these things can make sure that nothing gets missed during appointments, conversations with providers, and of course, tracking down any insurance information, which, as all of you on this call can probably relate, is very, very important. So the bottom line is that these are really just tools that can be used so that you and your loved one don't have to rely solely on your memories alone, since you are juggling a lot of different responsibilities at once and things can get a little convoluted. You can also act as a recording device and perhaps catch things that your loved one may miss or may have forgotten in their conversations with doctors. There's a lot of information being discussed in these appointments and can feel really overwhelming for the patient. A lot of people mention that they just totally black out during these, or they're tuning everything out because it's just almost too much to handle. So you being there as the clear mind and ears for your loved one is immensely helpful in remembering what these conversations consist of. Writing everything down so you have a record to refer back to is really, really helpful, whether these are questions, concerns, or observations to discuss future medical appointments. Keeping track of questions that might arise outside of appointment times, concerns regarding treatment or side effects, or even just certain observations that you've made during or after treatment can allow for a more involved process where you and your loved one are better able to be an active participant in their treatment plan and aren't always just being told what to do. The ability to be an active participant really does empower you a little bit and can make you feel like you are getting the best care that you should be. Also helpful to jot down any tips that are given to you from others in the caregiving community. It can be a challenging and somewhat isolating experience being responsible for the care of another. So learning from others' experiences can help to make the process less of a constant guessing game. From my experience, speaking with people in the cancer community, people love to share tips and things that worked for them. So kind of exploring what that might be can sort of take a lot of that guesswork out of the whole process. So let's move on to talking about creating an actual plan for yourself. As I've mentioned throughout, the news of a cancer diagnosis can cause both the diagnosed and those caring for them to feel as if many things are suddenly outside of their control. But creating an action plan to the extent that it's possible can really help you empower yourself and maybe even regain a sense of control over your circumstances. So here we've laid out the elements of a successful action plan. First, it addresses your unique needs and goals in terms of caregiving, work, your personal and family life, and so on. It's also key that there's some sense of priority given to the various items on your plan. But it's also important to remember that your loved one's protocols and treatment will likely be fluid and possible that it will change. And so while the plan that you outline might seem airtight today, it may have to be modified over time as things evolve. So it really is important to stay flexible and communicate appropriately at work. Additionally, when we think about a successful action plan in the context of work, it also incorporates your employer's needs as well as your own. So that's not to say that your employer's needs should be placed above yours or that there's no room for how to negotiate work and how it gets done. But it's important to make sure that these things get woven into your thinking as well so that they're more likely to be approved and for everybody involved to be more comfortable with the plan. And another critical component of an action plan is identifying the places where others might be able to pitch in. Now, for some, asking for help can be a real challenge, but when and where you feel comfortable doing so, asking for help can alleviate some of the stress and worries that may be weighing you down. So in a work context, this can mean creating a plan with your supervisor that both you and they feel comfortable with. Plan for a check-in once a month in order to make sure everyone's still feeling good about the setup. Consider any coworkers who may be a point person for you for questions and updates when you're away for the office. If you recognize that struggles are happening, reach out to a supervisor or coworker to see about temporarily delegating some of those responsibilities. It can be difficult, but can make all the difference. And finally, as we discussed, there's a benefit to having things written down, and the same is true here. So in a practice we often encourage is called a work diary, and this can be a really useful tool in helping you to evolve your action plan based on your caregiving needs. So as you gather your information and organize it accordingly, you'll want to take into consideration the specific needs both at work and at home. So this is an area where a work diary can be particularly helpful, really laying out concerns and potential solutions all in one place. While you, of course, can't predict the future, if you've been at your job for a reasonable amount of time, you're familiar with the energy, the focus, et cetera, that's required for you to do your job and meet the marks that you need to. As you start to think about what type of focus and energy caregiving is going to require from you, it's a good idea to think about how that may impact your ability to do this work. Try to think through how you might address these impacts. So for instance, less time, a totally different schedule, inability to be in person as much. All of these changes may mean that you need to rethink how you can best get your work done while seeing to your caregiving responsibilities. And as I mentioned, this one is the hardest for many, but asking for help is critical when you're giving your attention and energy to caregiving. There's going to be some things that you simply need to let go of control on. If you have kids, perhaps you could speak to family or friends about driving them to activities or school or play dates, et cetera. So it frees up some time for you to address perhaps some outstanding work or caregiving tasks. For work, you may need to delegate some less important work tasks so you're freed up enough to get those essentials of your job done. So an example of this might be if you're responsible for sending out certain invites for a meeting or planning office holiday parties. These are duties that, if asked in the right way, many coworkers would be willing to take over for the time being, knowing that it's not forever. Think realistically about what it looks like to take leave or work flexible hours. If your leave is, if you take unpaid leave, what kind of impact will that have on your finances? If you take paid sick leave, or if you have another loved one that might get sick, as everybody is experiencing colds in the flu season, how will you handle it if you've already used up all of your sick time? What does that look like? Now, boundaries are an important aspect of balancing life and work, regardless of your circumstances. So when caregiving is thrown into the mix, setting boundaries is even more important. Learning when you need to say no at work is really challenging, but also really necessary. Knowing you don't have the time to take on an extra project or to stay late. These are all things to assess and figure out how to address with your bosses and coworkers, so it's not an awkward situation right on the spot. And of course, as we've discussed throughout so far, developing a plan based on the information that you've gathered with the ability to pivot as necessary is also a really necessary step in setting yourself up for success. So let's just go over some approaches for making this work in cancer diary work for you. First, it can help you map out an overview of what it looks like to support your loved one through treatment, such as what treatment is likely to look like in both the short and longer term. So by collecting those important treatment-related dates like surgeries and chemo appointments and the information that's available to you about potentially recovery time, side effects, etc., you can then compare them to your work calendar and see where there might be any issues or conflicts in terms of scheduling. Of course, there may be certain appointments and treatments that are date specific, so you need to take priority over work deadlines, of course. But as we discussed, speaking with your loved one's healthcare team, try to see where there is flexibility. Your schedule is an area where there's an opportunity for you to become an active participant in your loved one's care by advocating for everyone's needs and ultimately feeling more in control of the process. And as we've noted a number of times today, self-care for a caregiver is incredibly important. So be specific with yourself about what your needs will be as you figure out how to manage the often competing responsibilities and tasks that you're juggling. So small things like making sure that you get fresh air every day, to bigger things where you can schedule some solid alone time for yourself can really pay off in keeping you grounded and helping to de-stress when necessary. It's also helpful to keep a detailed written record of your day-to-day activities at work, because this can really prove beneficial on a number of levels. This can include writing down a description of your projects, the associated tasks, what's been done, as well as a to-do list with next steps, because keeping notes in this way can help you stay organized and really effectively manage your time as you move through your days. It also creates a log with the tasks that you accomplish that each day or week or month, which can be helpful if your memory has been impacted by the competing responsibilities that you've been dealing with. I know that when I feel overwhelmed, I certainly have a lot of things that fall through the cracks. So the ability to write things down is really, really helpful. Tracking hours and assignments could prove valuable if a worst case scenario arises at work and you start to suspect that perhaps there might be some discrimination taking place as well. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we don't like to bring this up because we think that it's not likely to happen. But unfortunately, we do know that some people do run into problems with their workplaces. And so in those instances, having a notebook where you've been keeping a detailed account of your time and accomplishments can really prove to be very valuable if you do need to start to defend your work and what you've been working on. Now, disclosures are a really important consideration that can be really complex. So just to keep in mind that it's not an all or nothing decision, and understand what you're comfortable with, and also that the need for sharing at work may change over time. We tell people that disclosure exists on a spectrum. So for those who have decided to disclose their caregiving situation at work, you want to think about what and how much your supervisor and coworkers really need to know. For some people, the decision to disclose will mean sharing widely at work. Others will choose to keep the details to a minimum, which might mean disclosing only that they're providing care for someone, not necessarily all the details of their loved one's condition or really sharing that it's a cancer diagnosis. Also consider how your loved one feels about you disclosing their condition in the workplace. It's their information, so you have to be sure that they're comfortable with you sharing that as well. Workplace culture and environment can also play a big role. If you work at a small company where your colleagues feel like a second family and everyone talks about their personal life, weekends, kids, vacations, etc., or if it's a big corporation where the environment is really competitive and people are always just focused on heads down, working, getting things done. You want to think about the various ways that people are communicating with each other on the job to help you decide if, how, and really how much information you want to share at work. So it really depends on the culture, but sometimes sharing can create a whole new support network that you didn't know you had. So again, it's just assessing the environment that you're in. Remember, how much you share is, again, entirely up to you. And you can always share more later. So if you want to start off vague, that's totally fine. But just keeping in mind that once you share, it is out there. So sometimes doing it gradually can be more preferable for some people. Now, disclosure on the online space can have ramifications in the workplace as well. So we do recommend developing a personal disclosure plan for your online presence. Now, after discussing with your loved one and understanding what their disclosure preferences are, it's a really good idea to make clear decisions about what, if any, information about their cancer journey that you're going to be sharing online and off. Things like where you're going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs, etc. And it's a good idea to just spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you have shared at work and everyone's really supportive of you and your family, and that's outstanding. But the fact is that this internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond just right now and consider what those long-term impacts might possibly be. As I've mentioned numerous times, none of us can predict the future. So your really supportive boss who's been really helpful throughout this whole process for you may move on and be replaced by someone who starts Googling their new staff. And there's really no way to find out or to know how that person is going to respond to the information that they're finding online. Now, the next step is that after you've made these decisions about disclosure, communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people that you've connected to online, as there are unfortunately many stories of people who have experienced accidental disclosure from a loved one online. So for instance, a caring and concerned coworker may just feel really compelled to help and may start a GoFundMe for your family as a way to help without knowing that they actually just accidentally shared very private information that you and your family had wanted to keep confidential. And of course, even if you have shared your preferences, it is still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there and there's no surprises that come your way. So we've touched on some of the considerations when deciding whether or not to share information about your loved one's cancer status at work, but it's also just important to think about, are there legal benefits to disclosing? Are there interpersonal benefits to disclosing? Are there practical benefits to disclosing? And just really remembering that disclosure is a spectrum. So when you're thinking about this, there's really two things to consider overall, and that's how will your care for your loved one interfere with your ability to do your duties? And what legal benefits are there to sharing this information at work? So as with any personal decisions, there are, of course, different reasons that people choose to disclose. Some people can't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling others. But then there are others who feel very uncomfortable sharing personal information about their personal life at work, and they're much more private. So it's really however you feel about sharing in the workplace is valid and should be taken into account. As I mentioned before, really thinking about if someone in your company has gone through something similar, because it can really color the way that you think and approach your own situation by thinking back to how people responded to them. Were coworkers kind of grumbling behind their back that they had to take on different responsibilities? Did they think that it was it was kind of out of character for them to have to do those kinds of things. Just thinking of how that was handled. Was their supervisor supportive or not? When you're thinking of who to tell, this is going to really vary depending on you and your circumstances. You may have to have more than one conversation. So we tend to encourage people to start with the person that it might be easiest to talk to, which is typically someone's supervisor, as they're someone that they're going to have ongoing conversation with, and who could also potentially be an advocate for them with some higher ups or with HR. But it is also important to remember that most managers aren't trained to be managers. So this might be the first time that they're kind of having these kinds of conversations and could feel like they are in uncharted territory, which often means that the burden's put on the employee to kind of help teach the manager what they need to do next. So we actually developed a manager's toolkit. That's something concrete that people can take in to these conversations with their supervisors that really allows them to outline what would be helpful and make them feel most supported. So that's a tool that can be really useful, that can be found on our website, or you can order it in hard copy and have it mailed to you. For others, supervisor is out of the question, so they may go to HR instead. Your HR department can be a font of information because they're the ones that actually understand those handbooks we talked about, and they also may have had this same kind of experience in the past. So really, perhaps the most important thing to disclose in these conversations is the idea that your plan needs to be fluid. So you're really helping them understand the things you're telling them today are the things you know to be true right now, but they may not apply next week or next month or 6 months from now. And so this is likely to be an ongoing conversation with them. This can also help your employer understand that you intend to communicate with the most updated information that you can and kind of keep them in the loop. So it can ease some of that tension and stress for them as well. Now, while you may identify modifications that will work within the framing of your job and responsibilities, this doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be some concerns on the part of your employer. So part of the process when coming up with modifications should be walking your employer through how they're going to work, how any challenges can be addressed, and really ensuring that there's going to be that open dialogue so everyone's feeling good about the plan in place. At this point, we've really discussed the many considerations involved with disclosure. So once you've decided whether or not to share some or all of that information, think through the ways in which you'll be expressing your circumstance and needs. So providing some context can be helpful, but again, this is a personal decision of how much to share based on your own preferences. And of course, it's important to create that clear plan for the balancing of caregiving and working, so there's no confusion around expectations. So for instance, if you know you're going to be away from the office on Tuesdays to accompany your loved one to their chemo appointment, and you know you won't be able to take any calls on those days, make sure that this is communicated to your team so that all your calls will be scheduled for the Wednesday when you're working from home and helping your loved one recover from treatment. So you have more privacy and more ability to really address any needs at work. Also, if you have a good relationship with your manager or supervisor, you can be candid with them about your personal needs as well and kind of work to make sure that your self-care is still an active priority for you. There's always going to be some challenges to consider and prepare for. So despite those specific modifications working in theory, your employer, as I mentioned, may still have some concerns about how things are going to get done or if this will realistically work. So when you're brainstorming some of these practical modifications, really try to anticipate your employer, what their worries might be based on what you know about them and what you know about working with them, and then come up with proactive solutions. So if they're worried you won't be available to address a surprise on a project that you were working on because of your flexible hours, maybe suggest a point person to act as a backup contact in your absence during those times. Resentment among coworkers is another challenge that no one wants, but certainly a possibility. This is somewhere you can work with your supervisor to really ensure that a plan that's in place is really fair. And you can also ask your supervisor to express your situation on your behalf so there's no misunderstanding about what's going on. And also where possible and when comfortable, you can be direct with your coworkers so that they can come to you if they're having concerns about getting things done or if they're not really comfortable with the setup, you can kind of reassess. And of course, really just making sure that your plan plans for no misconceptions and realistic expectations. So being specific about your availability, having backup plans and coverage is important for everyone to feel comfortable, and so that they won't be left in a lurch due to you not being available at your normal times and hours. So circling back to the disclosure piece, these decisions will drive some of your strategy about how you're going to communicate at work. So as I mentioned earlier, a point person can be really helpful. They can be your go-to to find out about what's happening at work if you need to be away, or they might be able to answer certain questions for coworkers while you are out of the office. Being clear about your priorities and having a good understanding of what the expectations of you are is also really important. So whether or not you disclose this in the workplace, this is something you should do in collaboration with your supervisor if you can. And finally, this final point about limits, which we talked about, can be a real challenge. This is really a time when it's critical that you're honest with yourself about what you can and can't do at work, and then set some fair boundaries and stick to them. It's also important to recognize triggers and personal limits before you hit the wall and find yourself really overstressed. So another piece of this is recognizing the signs before you reach that point so that you're able to recalibrate before it happens. What we often find helps is something called professional no's. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read them, but you can certainly visit them. And these are just some really great examples for setting some of those boundaries at work, and gives you the language to use. So we've discussed the importance of anticipating concerns of your employer when making a plan of action for balancing work and caregiving. So when you plan for the conversation with your employer, you want to implement that same thinking. What your employer is likely to feel about this. Removing your own personal experience from this, how would you respond if an employee came to you with this situation and these requests? Then try to apply that logic when approaching your employer. And then back to the gathering information conversation, just bring what you know about existing policies to the conversation so your employer doesn't feel like it's on them to figure out what is and is not available already, and what they themselves need to approve separately outside of the existing policies. And the same goes for state and federal laws. What do you know about your eligibility for those? Having that information available will help your employer to feel less pressure to do the work on their end. And they may just need to confirm with HR as opposed to having them start the process of figuring it out themselves. And finally, understand that even if a proposed modification is initially approved, it may not necessarily be something that can be for the long term. So if it's not working out, or if there's a more time limited aspect, so maybe it was project specific, what might that look like moving forward? What's going to work if this one doesn't? Now, understandably, many people are unsure about how to have such conversations with a manager or supervisor. A good approach is to acknowledge that you're taking the time to be thoughtful about your employer's interests and concerns as well as your own. So again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read these, but these are a couple of examples of how to really start those conversations. If this language works for you in your situation, then you're welcome to use it, but you can always revise it to make it your own and make it as applicable as possible to your own situation. But overall, when you're preparing to begin these conversations, just be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are being met. And there's always the chance that your situation is brought up by someone in the office. And this is another instance where it really pays to be prepared for facing these situations head on. Such comments can be addressed by using a verbal technique that we call the swivel. It's a verbal formula or pattern that can be used in response to those cancer-related comments at work that may be made by a colleague or a supervisor, or as you can see here, an HR rep. So it really involves acknowledging the comment, putting an and right in the middle, and then really swiveling the conversation around to a topic that's work-oriented and something that's not so personal. Being able to shift these conversations back to a place where you feel comfortable can be empowering, and it just also goes to show that you are not your situation. You are still a valuable professional in the workplace. Now, with so much juggling going on, the balancing act can feel really overwhelming and really interrupt your focus. So this is when we recommend trying to go back to the basics in order to kind of maintain focus at work. So some helpful habits include doing one thing at a time, making a list of priorities, avoiding outside distractions by turning off phone and email while, of course, communicating that you won't be available at those times. Creating a cheat sheet. So if you're feeling distracted in the moment, you don't have that head scratching moment of, oh, what do I do in this process? I know I do this all the time, but I'm totally blanking. Stay organized and clear away any clutter, and always try to build breaks in your day. There is a really great benefit to productivity and taking short breaks that allow for a reset. So as I mentioned before, that can be getting fresh air, that can be looking out the window, that could be taking 20 minutes to listen to a podcast that relaxes you, whatever works for you, but just making sure that that's a part of your day. And of course, the challenges of caregiving can feel great and numerous. This is a selection from a caregiver's bill of rights that really provides some valuable reminders and affirmations. So feel free to use the link at the bottom of the slide to view the full copy. I encourage people to keep a copy of it with you when you're starting to feel overwhelmed or guilty or stressed, because sometimes, you know, when you are so responsible for someone else's needs and emotions, we really neglect ourselves, and we really forget what our own needs are, and we forget who we are. And so this can just be helpful to kind of remind yourself that you're doing a great job. So hopefully you found this information here helpful, or at the very least validating in your experience as a caregiver or a supporter to someone who is in the process of caregiving. But the main points I hope were driven home today are that it's really important to understand how caregiving can impact your life. And when you do recognize those impacts, work to understand how you can plan for those changes. Also, your personal needs, as I've said numerous times, are really important when balancing the responsibilities of and part of successfully balancing the work and caregiving roles. So you need to really understand how to set those boundaries. And finally, effective communication is critical to being able to successfully balance your work and caregiving. So really spending some time to prepare for those conversations and think through what your approaches are can make all the difference in getting your needs, and in turn your loved one's needs met. So I know we're getting short on time, so I'm just going to hand it back to Scott to tell you a little bit about some upcoming events, and then we should have time for a question or two.
Thank you, Nicole. That was great. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. And if we don't get to your question today, please shoot us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we'd be happy to answer everybody's questions one-on-one. Before we get there, though, we have our Midwest Conference on Working Cancer is coming up on March 24th. And then just keep your eyes peeled for in your inboxes. We should be announcing our slate of Balancing Working Cancer webinars any day now. And we're very excited for the lineup, and we hope that you'll join us for those as well. And then finally, Nicole, if you just want to go to the last slide, we'll leave it there, which again just reiterates the requirements for CEs. You'll receive an email tomorrow with the link for the evaluation and the post-test. And once again, any questions you have, feel free to shoot us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org. Now, let's get to some questions. The first one I have here is, I feel bad for my coworkers who have been working so hard to cover for me when I'm out of the office. Is there something I can do to let them know that I see and appreciate how much they're helping?
I mean, communication, making sure that you do communicate with them regularly, show appreciation for what they're doing. When you feel up for it, if you feel up for it, kind of sharing how things are going can make them feel a little bit more connected and make them feel like they're doing this for a reason. And also just checking in, just making sure that they still feel comfortable with the plan, that they don't feel like they're taking on too much. And if they do, then kind of reassessing the plan and seeing if there's something else that you can do to kind of set it up better for them.
Yeah, and I think too, like if you just make it known that you can call or text if there's like some emergency or something that they get stuck with, depending on your level of what you're dealing with on your own. But, a little gesture like that, I think can really help. I know even just when people go out on vacation, if I'm covering for someone, to know that they're like available if I need them quickly is so great. The next one I have here, my boss has been supportive so far, but I can feel some resentment growing. Is there a way to prove I'm still committed to my job while also making sure my loved one is taken care of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, scheduling some of those check-ins with your boss can be helpful. The work diary that was discussed, so you are really tracking what you've been doing, and you can kind of back up your work a little bit, talking about achievements that you've had, any kind of positive feedback that you've received or any projects that are going particularly well, just trying to focus on the positives, but also ensuring that, you know, you want to continue keeping the best interest of the company at front of mind. So are there certain things you could be doing better? Are there certain things that they would prefer you not doing? Things like that. Again, keeping that dialogue open, letting them know that work is still a priority for you. It's just, it's just a balancing act. So I think being open to any critiques is often important. You don't have to directly say, it seems like you're upset with me, but you can say, are there certain areas that you have concerns about? I'd love to address them with you.
That's great. And then I think this is going to be our last question. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Again, if we didn't get to your question, please shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org. It can be about caregiving. It can be about anything about balancing work and cancer, or balancing work and illness of any kind. We're happy to help you. The last question I have for you, Nicole, is I'm curious how to supervise my team and be a caregiver for my wife.
Sure. So I think, in those cases, you might want to really think of areas that you might be able to delegate responsibilities. Are there certain employees who are particularly good editors that might be able to read certain reports and things like that and kind of take that off of your plate? Again, you have to remember that these are all temporary changes, and asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. And so just keeping in mind that these are temporary changes that are going to make things easier for everybody. But like you said earlier, just letting people know that you are available if there are, urgent needs and things like that, and you will do your best to be as available as possible. But kind of just humanizing your experience and letting them know that, like, any kind of understanding in this time is really appreciated. I know that can be really hard, and it of course depends on whatever industry you're working in and what your team is like and what your relationships are like. But I think just delegation and asking for help, though challenging, is a really great start.
Thank you so much. We hope to see everybody next year for our new slate of programs, and keep your eye out for your email. And again, if you have any questions, please shoot us an email. We'd be happy to help you one-on-one. But thank you and good night. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.